and director of the MFA Interior Design program. I believe I was invited here today. I had done a gradeless assessment in the fall of 2022 that was approved by the dean and provost, and it was successful, and so happy to share my approach through that. We included on the syllabus a statement that said a grade will be issued to the university, but should not drive your decisions to develop your work as a creative individual. Inclusive evaluation will be foregrounded and frame the learning experience. There will be ongoing formative assessment and summative feedback at 4 assessment periods with peer faculty self-feedback. So that was what we had put in there, and we found that we needed an ecology of inclusive practices to really create a space of gradeless assessment in the class. And so I'm happy to talk about that. I've shared this recently at CCAC, the Southern Colleges of Art and Design, and it's a broader conversation that's happening right now. So that's why I'm really glad we're doing this here. And I learned about a lot of other ungrading practices, such as labor-based grading, which I'm happy to share today as well for anyone who's interested in that, where faculty were sharing that grades don't equate neatly into learning or even the quality of design. Judgment of the work are separated from the calculations of a course grade. So instead, grades in their courses signify that you have labored in some way, and so the labor is captured as opposed to evaluating the aesthetic or the visual quality of the work. So it's the social implications of making. So I'm going to put this in the chat here as well. Here's the chat, here's the book. So I just want to share that first. Some other really nice practices that are happening. So I would say, traditional grading is kind of an extrinsic motivation. So when students are moved to do work or behave because they are forced externally to them, so peer pressure, negative or hurtful teacher feedback, other ulterior goals such as better salaries, job prospects, so pressures external to the classroom, versus intrinsic motivations when students decide to engage in self-initiated behavior that they might do because they understand acts as joyous, led by their curiosity or important. So it's more likely to lead to the acquisition or retention of knowledge. So I like to distinguish between that in terms of understanding that traditional grades really lead to risk aversion, so that they're not experimenting or taking chances with new knowledge, and they might do things like search for cheats, the right answer, to get them the higher grade in gaming the system. So there's a lot of research now on that, and so I think, as I said, I think it's great to just share, what are their alternative practices that we want to lead with. So in my own classroom, I'm using, I start in terms of the kind of ecology, inclusive practices, really looking at starting with the democratic syllabus, and changing the tone of the classroom to make it non-authoritative, and leading with community agreements, so less directives and rules, and more consensus around how do we want to be assessed, what do we feel the emerging learning outcomes could be in there. And we use a practice around co-authorship to do that. So I'm always in co-authorship with my students, really looking at, starting with, how do they want to be assessed on this work? What do they think the learning outcomes were? And we're always in dialogue on that, and really working on building trust and giving away power, giving agency back to the student in that space. And the last part of my practice, I know these are short introductions, is really building a space to give inclusive and meaningful feedback. And a lot of those have taken the form of of novel methods. The feedback over grading. A project that I had worked on with Yvette Chaparro, the industrial design director, and Preeti Gopinath from FA Textiles is the colonized, decarbonized dinner party. So creating a space of feedback outside of the classroom and breaking down and critiquing those present and defend methods of giving feedback, but really opening up a dialogue between disciplines and in breaking the kind of gatekeeping that happens from within the classroom itself around assessing the work. And so we share knowledge, we build a community of makers and thinkers, and really bring in a plurality of voices to give feedback to develop the work further. As I said, grade is issued, but the expectation is if they're present, if they're doing the work, if they're involved in co-creating those learning outcomes, that there's participation in the class, and they'll do quite well. Happy to share anything further, but happy to pass it on as well.
Miller, do you want to go next?
Sure, I'll jump in. Thank you all for being here, and I'm happy to share space with you. And Michele, I really like so much of what you just said really resonated with me, and my practices. I use a version of Jesse Stommel's Ungrading in my classroom, which I came to really organically, because I realized that so much of what I was saying to my students about things like we're here to learn together and I'm not here to judge you. I'm here to give you the tools and skills for you to do this work for yourself. Oh, I should say I direct first year writing at Lang. And so I think particularly working with first year students, I find that one of the hugest leaps between high school and college is being in an oppressive environment where you're being told what to do, and choosing your education for yourself. And that is, I think, possibly the biggest leap that they make. And in terms of writing, that leap is really maybe most extreme, because we're asking them to move from completing an assignment where they're supposed to sound like everyone else, that's actually the goal, to asking them to explore their own voices and creativity and ideas. And we're asking them to write things. And I use the word professional, which maybe is confusing, but I think of professional writing as something that someone else would want to read. Something that goes beyond an audience of one who's your teacher so that they can give you a grade so that you don't get in trouble with your parents or whatever it is. And so asking them to make these leaps involves an enormous amount of risk. And I realized that in asking them to take all of these risks and saying all of these sort of liberatory things to them, and telling them that I'm trying to create this anti-authoritarian liberatory space, I was actually full of it if I was still giving them grades. And I realized that, and I kind of was like, well, why should they believe me? Since I'm still engaged in this scaffolded assessment practice, that's the same thing that they've known their entire educational lives, most of them. And so I just sort of started looking around at alternative assessment practices. And one of the things that I really noticed while I was doing that is that, and I think the reason that so many of us, or maybe this isn't why we chose to be faculty at a university rather than other kinds of teaching, but one of the things that I think most of us really love and appreciate about it is our freedom to be who we are in the classroom, and to have the conversations that we're excited to have and not be beholden to things like standardized testing. We value our freedoms in these ways so deeply. And yet many of us are still mired in these practices that we also despise. And I think most faculty hate grading, dread grading, and don't enjoy it. And it causes all of these problems. And so for me, moving away from that has been freeing kind of on every level. my feedback to my students improved, I think, drastically when I was no longer trying to write something that they would understand as justifying a grade. Um, and so in terms of the practicalities, my syllabus has a grading rubric on it still. And so it says things like, you know, 2 short thought pieces, 10% each, 2 longer essays, and a final project, and they each have a percentage or points of what they're worth. Um, Participation, all of the things you would expect to see. But instead of giving grades, I just give feedback. And then I ask my students to do their own self-assessment at the end of the semester. And over the course of the semester, I really ask them to think about grades as little as possible. And in fact, even when they do their self-assessment, I ask them to think about grades as little as possible. I ask them to go through from the positionality of having truly finished the course, having turned in their final project, to look back again at the rubric and to look at their work over the course of the semester and write 2 or 3 pages, which they turn into me about how they've seen their own work grow and change. And kind of evaluate narratively, looking at their pieces. And so they'll write things like, in this piece was the first time that I was able to express something that I'd never felt comfortable expressing before. But I didn't like, but I learned later that I wish I had used language differently. And so they narratively assess themselves, and talk about things that they're really working on that are very specific to them. I'm still working on using imagery in my writing. I'm still working on quote integration. That sounds fluid. And so they're reflecting their own kind of triumphs and challenges. And then I ask them to slap a grade on it at the end, which they do, and I put into the computer system. Um, I also will meet with them and talk about this, because especially sometimes it makes students very, very anxious. They're very used to having grades along the way to know if they're doing all right. Um, and I really approach this, I would say emotionally, more than anything, and also politically, because I think that what my experience, as a young student and as a young trans student in classrooms was often discriminatory. And so many of our students have been discriminated against and experienced discrimination in classrooms. And I think that's very much part of this conversation. Um, and a lot comes up for students. And I would say particularly students who have been the most discriminated against in the classroom, and particularly, I would say students who are femme-identified students of color will often talk to me throughout the semester and tell me, I'm used to doing 5 times as much as anyone else in the class. And this is every time I sit down to work, thinking about the fact that I'm going to be assessing myself, changes my relationship to that and makes me aware of that. So these are kind of ongoing conversations during the course of the semester that really center around, exactly as Michele said, like intrinsic experiences of their labor rather than extrinsic. And always I'm trying to say, what do you want to work on? What are you interested in about this piece of writing? And what is it that you want to say and work on? It's not coming from me. And to consistently kind of push them towards their own goals and interests. And what I have found, and then I'll pause, and I always want to hear what Helen is doing. But what I have noticed is that their work and their projects since I've been doing this, is far more rigorous and involved than what it was before, because they feel safer taking these risks. They feel safer biting off more than they can chew, because they know that they're not going to be punished. And it requires constant reminding, because I think they, and really we all, are so used to punishment, being part of education. And so when I say to them, you know, do a project that it's okay that you're not going to finish. Like when an academic publishes an article, they worked on it for a year first before they even sent it to a journal, and then it received peer feedback, and then this, like, these are the processes. You're not going to make anything quote unquote perfect. You're not going to make a perfect product like you were taught to write a 5-paragraph essay that actually anybody wants to read and that you feel good and excited about in a semester even. And so to think about your work as your own and as something that moves beyond this class. And I have really found they've made incredible things that they weren't making before. Our students are brilliant, and we all know that. And they're idiosyncratic, and we know that too. But not that they weren't doing good work before, but offering them this freedom, I think, has really changed the way that they're taking on their coursework.
Thanks so much, Miller. Helen.
Thank you all. It's so great to hear from you all. Miller, I'm really glad that you touched on the affect of this whole process. That's something I feel like I've been thinking about more recently, both the affect of grading, and then as Michele was talking about, shifting this balance of intrinsic and extrinsic motivations. One thing that I found is that students, and to a large extent just people in general, are so focused on extrinsic things that it can be hard to even notice what the intrinsic rewards of something are. And so I think encouraging students to pay attention to what the pleasures of their learning or creative process are, what the affective experience of what they're actually doing is a way of getting them to plug into and value the intrinsic rewards a little bit more. Also, Michele, I really want to hear more about the decolonized, decarbonized dinner party. That sounds amazing. So I want to share just a few quick resources, and then I'll briefly say what I do now, which is an imperfect system that I'm not perfectly happy with, or that I'm not completely happy with. But the first time that I came into this idea of non-grading or ungrading was through Alfie Kohn's article, The Case Against Grades, which I'll quote from briefly. He talks about grades tend to diminish students' interest in whatever they're learning. They create a preference for the easiest possible task. They reduce the quality of students' thinking and make them less likely to think for themselves. And then, as we've already touched on, extrinsic motivation, which includes a desire to get better grades, is not only different from, but often undermines intrinsic motivation, the desire to learn for its own sake. And many, many other people have written about this. Alfie Kohn went on to write a book that I still haven't read, but desperately want to read, called Punished by Rewards. We've mentioned the labor log, or labor or contract-based grading. I also appreciate this resource. And then I guess I'll also say I came to this out of an experience as a student in writing workshops for many years, and thinking about, and that's actually not even a context where things are graded, but it's a context that is conventionally super dependent on a dynamic of praise and criticism, such that once, when I was asked to come into a course mid-semester and take over for somebody who had not been able to complete the semester and whose students had been doing a lot of the leading the work themselves, I was like, how have you guys been running workshops? And the students had led the workshops, and they were like, well, we just go through all the good things and then all the bad things about the work. And so I really, really believe that this evaluation-based model that doesn't tend to be explicit about its evaluative norms tends to entrench structurally problematic, politically problematic ways of approaching the work, and to psychologically harm the students and thinkers and creative people who are making the work. So I was reading a lot about different ways to run creative workshops, and I'll put a couple of those things in the chat as well. Oops. And then I ended up writing something that explains the way that I've since tried to talk about work with students, avoiding this hyper evaluatory or hyper evaluative approach. So with that in mind, what I do now is I start the semester with a few exercises geared to help students identify their own values as scholars, as creative people, as artists, writers, whatever. And I do that by asking them to bring in work that they love, a text in my course, and then to think about why they love it. It becomes kind of like an icebreaker or mixer where they talk about this with each other. And through that process to identify qualities that they value when they are looking at a written text. And we talk about how that might vary in context, but students might say, like, I love a text that is honest. I love a text that's simple. I love a text that's not simple. I love a text that wraps up neatly at the end. I love a text that is open-ended. So we have this conversation and students write a list of their values, and then they return to that list and revise it throughout the semester. And I do a similar process to Miller, where I have students evaluate their own, or not reflect on their own work, I should say, through self-reflections. I do that throughout the semester with each of their big assignments, both at the draft stage and the revision stage. And at every round, I'm asking them to connect their reflections to their own values. So if honesty is something you really value, how are you enacting that on the page? If clarity is something you really value, how are you attempting to be as clear as possible? So that's what I add to this process. I do, like Miller, eventually, or at the end of each stage of a major assignment, I do ask students to assign grades to themselves. And to be honest, I don't like doing that, and I'd like to find a different solution. So I'm interested to hear from people who use a labor-based model or other models that are truly gradeless, as opposed to what my model is right now, which I think is more like self-grading. So it shifts the power dynamic, but still puts this kind of pressured and often for students uncomfortable moment of attaching their self-reflections to a grade.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank all three of you so much. We'll just, at this point, we'll just open it up. Please feel free to either just unmute yourself or raise your hand. Harry, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry I joined this late, so I'm just catching what I caught. But in terms of like having a rubric where students write 2 to 3 pages about their own work, and then I guess this is also like I want to embrace ungrading, but have there been times when people see their work, I think, in a way where they think there seems to be a discrepancy with how they perceive they did in the class and then how you think they did in the class, and how do you handle that if there's a big discrepancy there?
Yeah. I'll start. It's a great question, Gary. Thank you. For one thing, I think that it doesn't happen very often. It happens less often than you might imagine. And I have them do that process only at the very end of the semester. I don't do it after each assignment. And I think that may just be reflective to some extent of how I work, which is that like I find it really hard to evaluate things right in the moment well. And I think that's probably true for a lot of people, and I like to let a little time pass. But usually my students are very, when they reflect back, like the reflections are very similar to mine. Um, I often find, and every now and again, there's someone who really is off what I would have said to them. And I think I kind of have learned to just let that go personally. And what I say to myself when that happens is the student has received my feedback all semester long. And if they're not really listening to me, and if they're not really being honest with themselves about their work, like that's not a problem for me to solve. That's an issue that they will continue working on, I hope, in their life. Um, I would say that most often what happens is that I'll disagree with a student who's being far too hard on themselves or hypercritical. And again, I would say that the majority of students who that happens with are students of color. And just to give an anecdote, I had a student during the semester that we were entirely online during COVID, the height of COVID. And this student was caring for younger siblings at home and caring for a sick grandparent who passed away during the semester. And the student turned in every single piece of work, usually a couple of days late. Um, they missed just under the like school's allowance of classes, and were late a few other times. When they came to class, they were a huge part of the class. They were an amazing student. They worked so hard. Their writing was fantastic. But this was a student who was used to doing 10 times as much as everyone else. And they tried to give themselves a C minus in my class. And I met with them and I just said, this is unacceptable. I will not put this grade into the computer. And we talked about it. We had a really long conversation about it. It was heartbreaking. But we had a wonderful conversation, and I was just like, look at what you've accomplished in the context that you've accomplished it. And we wound up, having a really lovely conversation, and they changed their grade. Um, themselves. But I mean, it's really, I think the other thing that happens too is that students worry, like we're so used to being judged that they worry that I'm going to judge them for the grades that they give themselves after I spend all semester telling them that I think it's a meaningless system. And I don't want them to think about it at all. And it's because I have to put something in the computer and it doesn't reflect their learning. And so I have taken to reminding them, at the end of the semester, right, they're unlearning it too. Like at the end of the semester, I'll be like, let me just remind you, I'm doing all of this because I'm not here to judge you, and I won't, and I can't. And so if you're worried that I'm going to judge you for giving yourself an A minus and you're sitting there thinking Miller's going to think that I'm giving myself too high of a grade, I'm like, think about why I've devised this entire thing, right? Like I'm doing this whole thing because I'm not here to judge you. So that has actually helped. But yeah, I would say that they're unlearning the like white supremacy and the perfectionism that comes with that. Um, is a huge learning curve, but such a valuable one.
Yeah, I would add, like, I think it's a slow process for me as a teacher to come fully into ungrading, as well as for the students. And Carrie, to speak to your question, like when I very first started doing this, and I don't do this anymore, maybe I should, but I used to ask students to reflect on very specific skills that I was hoping the course would give them. So for instance, I'd have students reflect on like using and analyzing quotes or something in their research papers. And I remember really specifically one moment where a student who I had just been in a conversation with about how she used and analyzed quotes for weeks. I read a revision of her work and I was personally kind of disappointed, like it still didn't go as far as I hoped or imagined she could. And in her reflection, she was like, I'm using and analyzing quotes so much better, blah, 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 than I was before. And somehow I realized in reading that even though the difference I perceived was quite small, I realized that she actually had really, really changed her attention in the way she was writing, and that she had really learned something. And that was really instructive for me as a teacher, because I was like, we might not immediately see on paper the results of something we're trying to teach students, but hearing her reflection about it made me realize that she had actually really learned something, even if it wasn't completely coming out on the page yet. And I guess that speaks to the value of just the reflective process for students, which I think is another reason to try this out. And something I do with my reflections, even and maybe especially at the very last stage of the process, like Miller was talking about, I don't suggest to students that their work needs to be finished at the end of the semester. So I often ask them, like, what might the next stage of this process look like? And I think that's another moment where students can reflect on the future of their work. That's actually like in itself such a huge learning exercise, to like imagine what else it could be, to imagine the next phase of a project if you had a bunch more time. So I think that also just speaks to the learning value of these reflections.
Carrie?
Hi. I kind of, I wanted to ask a question, but maybe it's a long one because it's a little bit reflecting on how I'm hearing all this. I love the idea of ungrading. I've been really interested in not having grades for a long time. I think for me, because I teach architecture, I think how we determine quality in architectural projects can feel really vague to students. And so I find that I often use rubrics as pedagogical tools in order to show the students, in order to really, like, I'm really kind of teaching through the grading. Like I'm teaching through the rubric in terms of really clearly visualizing for them how quality is determined in their projects and what the sort of metrics and goals are. And so I guess I'm wondering if there are better ways for me to kind of deliver that information to them. And I also, when I do assign them like a number grade in each like quadrant of the rubric, but at the same time, I also give them a comment on their work. So I reflect on their success or how they could improve in each category. So for me, that process is very, I don't know, it's actually where a lot of the kind of I guess I feel a little bit nervous about letting go of some of that, I think is what I'm trying to say. And I don't know if others have the same reflection and if, others have had similar experiences.
Can I jump? Carrie, it's great to meet you. I'm also teaching within interior design and architecture, and so understand the context you're coming from. And I think we have to deal with design reviews, and a lot of that feedback is so performative, and a lot of times not helpful for the students in terms of those learning outcomes. I think I really appreciate that, even the using of rubrics, I think is really can be really helpful, that we're all looking at, we're looking at these outcomes. I think the approach that I took with those is I'll still use them as well, but we leave space for new knowledge and emerging ideas and outcomes with it. And so that's why I may propose and start with a rubric, and then we kind of look at it before we even start a project and like, okay, this is where we're starting. What would you add or edit? And then we come back to it at the end and reevaluate it.
I actually often have the students just build their own rubrics for the project. And to work together with them to build the rubric. Like, how do you think this project should be evaluated? And then help them to kind of fill in the gaps. But largely they will create the same rubric that I would have created in the end, you know. And it's great to see them kind of think through that process. Yeah, I totally. And I think, you know, NAB requires the rubrics, the like architectural accreditation board. If you're teaching with somebody where there's accreditation, they require the rubrics to be submitted to them. So that's kind of like, it's an interesting piece of this as well. Whether they require actual grades or not, I'm not sure. It maybe could just be comments, and maybe that's enough, and letting go of those numbers is fine in the end.
Cynthia.
Yeah, I had two questions. One was accreditation, and how much of this can we actually deploy at scale before we get in trouble with accreditors? Is it, yeah, do they need us to grade or not? I know across the graduate programs in design strategies, there's consensus we'd be happy to do away with grades and just be on a pass-fail, which is a move in many graduate programs in the United States. So maybe I'll add it to my to-do list to look into the accreditation implications of doing away with grades altogether. And the second part, perhaps correlated to this idea of how do we deploy these initiatives at scale, relate to the additional labor involved when we want to deploy alternative ways of teaching. I use a labor-based contract grading rubric in my teaching, and I would say I have to dedicate at least one full class distributed across classes, but it does eat up at least a whole week of time that they're maybe not learning about the course material itself, because it's not a course about grading. I'm curious to hear if you all have experience that it is additional work, especially in areas where the vast majority of our faculty are part-time faculty. We hesitate to encourage practices at scale that will require additional work. It's much quicker to give someone a grade than to give them feedback, written feedback especially. And Miller, when you were speaking, talking about these additional conversations you have with students, and you have all these conversations, it sounds wonderful for their own learning and growth, but how might we then factor in the cost of that as well within our institution?
Yeah. Helen, do you want to jump in?
Well, I did, sorry. Somehow I can't find the raise hand button, so I apologize. I'll quickly say that for me, it hasn't been extra work at all, and that may simply be because I already was providing a lot of feedback on students' work. So basically, I just subtracted the grade part of my feedback and still do everything else, which is not to say that I'm not doing a ton more work than I should be doing as part-time faculty. But that's a brief aside. I wanted to say really quickly about the metrics and goals thing. Coming from totally outside of your field, I wanted, if this isn't already part of the process, to Carrie's question, I just think that it can be so interesting and useful to talk with students about where those metrics and goals come from. So, you know, they may be within the industry. I know at least within writing, there's like once you start looking closely, the politics of how writing is evaluated are so deep and interesting. So that's where I start my conversations with students in the semester. Like, where do these norms come from? What are they doing? You know, even I'll have a conversation with students about like the 5-paragraph essay. Why is that conventional? Because it's easy for your teachers. Is it fun to read? No. I mean, like, everybody can come to that conclusion when we talk about it. And so I guess I'd be curious what it would be like in your field to begin with a conversation that frames the sort of normative metrics and goals, and then give students an option about whether they want to adhere to those norms, stray from those norms, do some combination, try both, and so on.
Yeah, I'll just add to that a couple things. Like, I tend to talk to my students about genre and form. And, like, the comment is a genre and the rubric is a form, and like thinking about how those things function, and say, like, these are the norms of the field. Here's what we use these genres for. Here's what we do formally in these ways. And then we're kind of evaluating those things in a deeper way than just using them. And that I find to be empowering to students. And it seems like I wouldn't know how to apply it in every field, but I think it could be applied in every field because every field has its own genres and norms and formal practices. Um, and I would say, like Helen, if anything, I think this has saved me time, because responding to student work has become less stressful and easier, and quicker. I feel like I'm responding more quickly because it doesn't feel as forced. Um, and so that for me is a time, maybe even saver. Um, and I think additionally, because I'm working within a first year context generally, I tend to think that what I'm teaching students, like whatever the content is, matters less than them learning how to learn and how to think critically and how to be in a seminar. Um, and while I think that's of particular importance in something like a first year writing class, I really think it's of importance certainly throughout all of undergraduate work. And I don't know about the rest of you, but like I don't remember half of the content. If I remembered half of the content of my undergraduate work, that would be a miracle. That would be a miracle. I don't remember very much of it at all. But and I went to a small liberal arts college. When I went to graduate school and I had taken time off, and I was surrounded by a lot of people who hadn't taken time off and seemed to be like on it in ways that I wasn't, I very quickly realized that the way that I knew how to engage with text, the way I knew how to ask questions, the way I knew how to respond to my fellow students was completely different than what most of them were able to do. And I realized it wasn't until then, and it had nothing to do with the content, I realized what an absolute miracle my undergraduate education had been. And it was about the way that I learned how to think, more than anything else. And I think that's what we're doing too at the new school. And so I think sometimes it's easy for us as faculty to be overly focused on content, over process. And so I try to remind myself, and it's really hard because I come in with an Audre Lorde poem and I want to talk about it for an hour and a half. And then like we wind up having to talk about something else for half an hour. But I think that it's really easy, even for me, I have to keep reminding myself, like, it doesn't matter if we don't finish this material in the way that I might think.
You know, I would love to say something in response to this conversation, is because I also had a feeling it would be, if not a time saver, at least an emotional saver, because the amount of energy you put into thinking about letter grades is just, ugh. What I would love to think, in addition to the accreditation question, is institutionally, I think what Miller said about we're helping students learn to learn and to think and to grow and to be human beings. But we have so many part-time faculty, and we have certain curricula that are structured in particular ways. And I think it would be so exciting to think institutionally about how we could actually bring these practices into all of our classes. I know that's a big one, but I just figured I'd put that one on the table.
Rita, I just want to add that from what I hear in faculty meetings, it doesn't seem as if the new school is drowning in potential students. And, you know, to me, this is the kind of thing that would be a huge draw to students. And again, maybe it's sort of a macrocosm of what I was saying earlier. If I tell my students I'm not here to judge them, I'm here to learn alongside you, but then I'm actually judging them with a grade, I'm full of it. And so too, we can say at the new school, this is a progressive education. Like, we're here to do this and this and this, but we're also just going to judge you and give you these grades that are part of this ridiculous system that we all live under. I think this would be a huge draw for students and would be so in line with who we already say we are, and who we sometimes actually are.
Tamer.
Yeah, just a kind of timely anecdote from the other side of things, which is that our son went to Hampshire College. Someone put that in the chat, narrative evaluations, no grades. I think he's on his maybe 7th or 8th conversation with admissions at Philadelphia, at the Community College of Philadelphia, where he's pursuing nursing education in order to get them to understand what in the hell that transcript means. And it's resulting in him having to retake courses for when he already has a bachelor's degree in an associate's degree program, where they're asking him to take English courses when he's taken courses at, highly accredited undergraduate institutions. So there's still a cultural misfit there. Just wanted to point that out. It's, and I'm a big fan of what Hampshire does and how they approach things. And I would love to move to narrative grades and get away from the kind of alphabetical grades. So it's wonderful. And there's the rest of the world is still not quite ready for it. But I also want to thank everybody. This was so great. It's so exciting. I've been trying for so long to sort of move away from judgment in the classroom, and it's so great to hear all these different strategies for that. And I did sort of stumble into ungrading and tried it out last year in a class. And it's been sort of aligned with where my sort of teaching and pedagogy and philosophy of it has been going anyway. And I had an amazing class. Students did great work. It was super exciting. And I found the whole process of kind of having them evaluate themselves deeply unsatisfying in the end. The students who are just really, giving everything every week end up being very self-critical. And then, other students who are kind of showing up and not doing that much or being sort of overly in praise of their work. And so it was just an interesting experience. And clearly, some of it or a lot of it is on me for not being very good at doing this. So, I'd be the first to admit that I own a lot of the issue when it comes to this. But I wonder if others have had that sort of experience of just, and then through all that kind of murk, in the end, it's me having to put in a grade into the computer at the end of the day, and just how kind of, sort of deeply unsatisfying that was. And yet in the context of a class that felt great. And I think the students had a great, I hope they had a good experience as well. That was my sense. So yeah, I'd love to hear if others had that experience and whether it is just a question of kind of practice, fine tuning, getting better at it. Thanks.
I'll quickly say I've somewhat had that experience here and there. And I've shifted my thinking or feeling about it as opposed to shifting the outcome. So I don't know if that sounds satisfying, but I guess another thing that I've gotten as a faculty member from this is just the sense, it's really clear to my students, I think, because of this process, that my class is for them and that if they put a lot into it, they'll get a lot out of it. And sometimes I'm like, this student doesn't want to put a lot into this, and that's fine. Like this, my class is an offering to them, and they can take it and do what they want with it. So maybe that's limited, you know, in the sense of like what might carry out into a career or the rest of the world, but that's kind of how I've been living with it now.
Yeah, and I've read a bit about contract grading as well, which I like in the sense that it, you know, it really foregrounds the student's design. Not every student wants to, you know, get an A in every class, and that's fine, you know. And so part of the contract grading, as I understand it, is also, you know, the opportunity to kind of say, you know, I'm really going just shooting for a B here. I got a lot to do. I have a lot of responsibilities, and, you know, don't hold me to a standard that I'm not aspiring to.
Jennifer, I wonder if I could put you on the spot, since you're a mathematician, and wondering how you're thinking about what's been discussed.
Yeah, I'm thinking many things. I've been very hesitant to have the students self-assess because, you know, math comes with such baggage, and it's sort of predictable what kinds of people tend to undervalue their abilities over others. And I have not really wanted to see that, and have not been prepared to kind of shift that significantly. But the other thing is that there is a movement in math education circles to do, I don't know what it's really called, but I'll call it sort of portfolio assessment, where if you are able to articulate a list of skills, and then it's like a contract. If you have multiple chances to demonstrate those skills, and there's a contract, like if you get the basic 50% of them down, then you get a C, and if you're able to do these additional skills, you get a B, and so on and so forth. And so that works like a contract in the fact that the students can choose how they want to approach the course. But I've found it difficult. It works very well for courses whose intent is really skill-based. And it's a little bit more difficult when your class is sort of a combination of conceptual and skills-based. So one of the things I am trying this semester, I teach a class that combines math and art. And I am trying something because my other concern is confusing formative with summative assessments. So I need students to turn things in regularly because it forces them to try things, and you can't learn in math without trying things. But then I don't want to give them grades if they're just trying it. So, and that's always been a problem, and I can't seem to get enough work out of them to sort of separate the two things out. So I'm trying an experiment where I give them regular practice problems, which I then give them feedback, ungraded feedback on. And I have to say, it's really nice not to have to assign a number to it, but just give them feedback. And then I'm having them turn in a mathematics portfolio where I ask them to create different math problems that sort of fit specific situations that demonstrate certain ideas that we've been talking about. So they have to create the problem and then solve it. And that sort of goes along with the visualization projects I have to do. So I just got my first batch right now, and I haven't had a chance to see how they are. So I'm a little bit nervous. That's what's on my mind.
Thanks. We have about a minute left. Any last questions, comments, concerns, enthusiasms? Cynthia.
Well, maybe I will plug something that I do, and if we all did it, we could have some additional sessions like this one and share with more colleagues. I use the custom questions of the course evaluation system at the new school to ask students to reflect on the grading rubric, the grading approach in the class, and ask questions like, do you think it should be deployed in other classes? And did it make you feel more included? Were you less worried about grading than you normally have been? These kinds of questions. Happy to share the questions. But I'm trying to build data. So I ask the same set of questions every time that I use that rubric. And if others also get feedback on it, I would be really excited about that. Maybe we could even write something together or amplify it further at the new school.
Thanks, Cynthia. To that point, we will we'll share the recording and all of the links. And if people are interested in keeping this conversation going, I think that would be really fantastic in sharing resources, ideas. What Cynthia is really talking about is also scholarship of teaching and learning, and to develop collaborators around pedagogy, I think would be a fantastic idea.
Also, I'm including our upcoming workshop list just to plug it in the chat. Other things coming up, but yes, you will get an email from me soon after this, and everybody's email addresses will be in there, so folks can keep talking.
Thank you, everybody. This was really fantastic, and thank you especially Michele, Miller, and Helen.
Thank you all
And
all
for
so
the
much.
work that you do.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.